The chandeliers of Manhattan's grandest ballroom glittered like a sky full of false stars, each crystal reflecting wealth, arrogance, and privilege. It was a night meant to showcase power. The city's most influential families had gathered to celebrate the opening of Thompson Holdings' newest skyscraper. Waiters in pristine uniforms carried trays of champagne. Laughter echoed between marble pillars. On the surface, it was elegance. But beneath the golden shine was a crueler truth, one that would soon surface in the ugliest of ways. Among the uniformed staff was a woman who didn't belong to that glittering world. Kesha Williams, 35 years old, wore an apron instead, of silk, carried trays instead of pearls, and bent her back for wages that would barely cover rent. She wasn't meant to be seen, not in that room, not among those chandeliers, and certainly not on that polished dance floor. Yet fate has a way of placing the overlooked at the center of stories that the powerful never expect to lose. The moment came quickly, too quickly for her to prepare. One slip, one stumble, one tray of crystal crashing against the marble, and the laughter in the room changed. Not the polite laughter of celebration, but the sharp, mocking kind that slices like a knife. From the center of the room, William Thompson III, the millionaire host of the evening, raised his glass high. His voice boomed louder than the orchestra, drunk on whiskey and pride. "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry my son to you." The words, flung like a cruel joke, ricocheted off the marble walls and froze the room in silence. For the elite, it was entertainment. For William, it was power. For Kesha, it was humiliation, though not in the way anyone imagined. Jonathan Thompson, the son caught in the spotlight of his father's arrogance, whispered desperately for him to stop. But William ignored him. He wanted a spectacle, and nothing entertains the wealthy more than watching the powerless struggle. Guests leaned in, whispering behind jeweled hands. Some smirked. Others shook their heads as though this was just another acceptable cruelty among the rich. And there, kneeling among the shards of crystal, Kesha lifted her gaze. Her eyes weren't pleading. They weren't broken. Instead, they carried the kind of quiet fire that unsettles those who think they know a person's place. For in that instant, her silence spoke louder than William's booming arrogance. It was the silence of someone remembering who she once was. Someone no ballroom of elites could contain, no cruel joke could erase. The orchestra shifted nervously. The air grew tense. Even the laughter faltered when Kesha's calm voice finally cut through the room like a blade. "I accept," she said. A wave of disbelief rippled across the hall. Some laughed harder, mistaking courage for foolishness. Others felt an unfamiliar chill, though they couldn't explain why. William blinked in shock. He had expected tears, maybe begging, but not this. Not defiance. What none of them knew was that Kesha carried a past none of them could imagine. A past of stages, lights, ovations, and headlines. A past buried beneath tragedy and years of struggle. To them, she was only a maid. Someone meant to serve and disappear. But that night, she was about to remind them all of a truth they had long forgotten. Greatness doesn't vanish just because the world refuses to see it. This is not just a story of prejudice. It is a story of power, dignity, and a single waltz that shattered an empire of arrogance. Stay with me, because what happens next will prove that the cost of underestimating someone is always far higher than the wealthy dare to believe. The ballroom glittered with artificial grace, yet beneath the chandeliers, something darker was brewing. When Victoria Thompson, 50 years old and proud of her reputation as Manhattan's favorite ballroom instructor, stepped forward with a venomous smile, she carried herself as if the outcome of this so-called challenge was already secured. She dismissed Kesha with a flick of her hand, amused at the thought of lowering herself to compete with someone she considered beneath her. William Thompson, already drunk on power and whiskey, encouraged his wife with gleeful cruelty, reminding the audience that she had won a club waltz trophy the year before. "That should be more than enough," he declared, for this pathetic little demonstration. While the crowd whispered and laughed, Kesha stood still. Outwardly, she appeared to be the maid they all believed her to be, silent and ordinary. Inwardly, though, her mind slipped backward through time. 15 years earlier, she had been Kesha Maro, principal dancer with the American National Ballet, a name whispered in awe by critics and audiences alike. She remembered the thunderous ovations, the reviews that compared her to the greatest ballerinas of the century, the feeling of weightlessness as she spun and leapt across the world's most revered stages. She remembered, too, how it had all ended in one brutal night. A performance for politicians and dignitaries, the long drive home, the crash that shattered glass and bone and future alike. She had spent 3 months in a coma before awakening, to a doctor's verdict that her legs would never again carry her into the heights of her art. Walking was a miracle. Dancing was impossible. William called his son, Jonathan, forward, demanding that he fetch a camera to record what he considered a moment of comic humiliation. Jonathan resisted, his conscience uneasy, but William's cruelty extended even to his own blood. He threatened his son with exposure, reminding him of a recent embarrassment that would ruin his relationship if revealed. Jonathan's face paled. The blackmail was clear. Kesha understood then that William's grip on power was not just financial but psychological, built on intimidation and fear. Music was ordered. Bets were placed. $500 for those who favored Victoria, $1,000 for those reckless enough to gamble on the Maid. The crowd chuckled, delighted by the spectacle. William approached Kesha with a wicked grin, promising that when she lost, she would kneel before them all and beg forgiveness before being fired. In that moment, the spark within her reignited. The same resolve that had carried her through grueling physical therapy, the same strength that had kept her alive. When everything she had built was stripped away, the same dignity that poverty had not erased, these rose in her now. Her eyes, calm and unflinching, unsettled even the most heartless in the room. She answered William's cruelty with an equally unflinching demand. When she won, and she spoke as though victory were already assured, he would keep his word. Not only about the marriage, but he would also admit in front of every witness that he had judged her wrongly, that he had mocked her because of the color of her skin and the uniform she wore, and that he would issue a public apology. The hall tightened in tension. Guests whispered in discomfort. William laughed, dismissing her courage as foolishness, agreeing to her terms with the confidence of a man certain he held the upper hand. What he failed to recognize was that he had just given his prey the platform on which she would destroy him. Victoria began her stretches, theatrical and showy, a performance for the crowd before the performance itself. Kesha, still motionless, allowed her mind to sharpen into focus. 15 years of pain, struggle, and rehabilitation had forged her into something stronger than any ballroom amateur. She recalled the lonely nights when she retrained her body in secret, forcing her muscles to obey, forcing her spirit to remember what it meant to soar. Now she stood at the threshold of a stage she had never expected to see again, not the National Theater with its velvet curtains, but a gilded cage filled with the arrogant rich who saw her as nothing more than disposable labor. Guests whispered that she looked inexperienced, some pitying her, others relishing the humiliation to come. William prowled the room like a predator, egging on the wagers, raising his champagne glass as though he were conducting the cruelty itself. He announced that she wouldn't last through a single song, that she would run out in disgrace halfway through. The laughter rolled on, but amid the sneers, Kesha noticed Jonathan again. Unlike his father, Jonathan was not laughing. His eyes betrayed discomfort, perhaps even shame, as he watched the cruelty unfold. She remembered then the moments weeks before when he had treated workers with rare decency, a flicker of kindness in a world that despised her presence. It was then that Marcus, the head of security, appeared at her side. A man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a steady bearing, he leaned close under the guise of checking his radio. In a voice too low for anyone else to hear, he revealed that he remembered her. He had been there 15 years ago at the National Theater. He had seen her brilliance. He had thought she was dead. The revelation struck Kesha like lightning, her carefully guarded anonymity suddenly pierced. Yet instead of fear, she felt a strange relief. Someone knew. Someone still remembered who she really was. Marcus told her that what was happening was unjust, a cruelty beyond measure. Kesha met his gaze, and for the first time in 15 years, allowed her true self to resurface. She asked him for a favor. Record everything. Not just the dance, but the reactions. Every flicker of shock, every sign of hypocrisy. Marcus nodded, puzzled but obedient. She smiled faintly, for she understood something that William never would. Underestimation is often the most expensive mistake the powerful can make. And just when the cruelty seemed unbearable, William heightened it further. He bellowed to the crowd that if Kesha managed to last the entire song without falling, he would give her $1,000. But if she failed, she would scrub the entire ballroom on her knees before every guest. Some laughed, some shifted uneasily, but none spoke against him. Jonathan tried once more to intervene, but his father silenced him with venom, declaring that people like her needed to know their place. Free. Words hung in the air like poison. Kesha began to stretch, subtle movements invisible to most, but Marcus recognized them instantly. They were the precise preparations of a professional, the rituals of an artist about to step onto the stage. His breath caught as he realized the truth. She was not preparing for humiliation, but for resurrection. The ballroom quieted as Victoria demanded the music begin, her voice sharp with the confidence of someone certain that the performance was already hers. The DJ, uneasy but obedient, cued the waltz, and she took to the floor. Her movements were polished enough to impress amateurs, deliberate steps learned from expensive instructors, graceful only to those who did not know the difference between practiced elegance and true artistry. To the wealthy guests, her motions were good enough, her rhythm passable, her effort a reflection of their own privilege. They clapped politely, unwilling to admit that what they were witnessing was no more than an exercise in vanity. William beamed with pride at his wife, raising his glass in exaggerated applause. His voice carried through the hall as he declared her victory certain, her performance flawless. He looked at Kesha as though she were already defeated, but Kesha did not flinch. She waited in silence, her stillness more commanding than Victoria's flourishes. When Victoria finished and stepped back with a self-satisfied smirk, all eyes turned toward the maid who dared to challenge not only the millionaire's wife, but the entire social order of that room. Kesha walked slowly to the center of the floor, every step measured, every breath deliberate, every gesture filled with a dignity that unsettled the audience. The DJ, reluctant but bound by William's orders, asked if she had a preference. Kesha requested the same song, but from the beginning. Laughter rose again, dismissive and cruel. To them it seemed as if she wanted another chance simply to fail, more spectacularly, but what none of them realized was that she had chosen that piece for a reason. It was etched into her very soul, a waltz she had performed countless times during her prime, a composition that had carried her to ovations and standing cheers, one of her final masterpieces before the accident that ended her career. The notes were woven into her muscle memory, into the very rhythm of her heartbeat. The music began once more, and for a heartbeat the crowd leaned forward, expecting clumsy steps, stiff movements, and inevitable humiliation. Instead, what they saw left them breathless. Kesha's body rose with a grace that seemed to defy gravity itself. Her first steps were soft and measured, almost shy, as though she were luring the audience into their own expectations. But then the transformation began. Her arms extended like wings. Her turns flowed like water. Her leaps defied the limits they thought her body should have. Each movement carried not just technical precision, but an emotion so raw that the very air in the ballroom seemed to shift. The laughter stopped. The smirks faded. Even the orchestra, though not playing, leaned in instinctively, recognizing the discipline of someone who had lived in music, not learned it as a pastime. William froze, his face contorting from amusement to disbelief, then to a creeping terror as he realized that this was not the clumsy spectacle he had promised his guests. Victoria's confidence drained, her smirk disappearing as she watched an artistry that dwarfed her own experience. For the first time that evening, she understood she had never truly danced. Kesha flowed into a sequence of pirouettes, each turn balanced with the elegance of years spent at the pinnacle of professional ballet. She leapt into a grand jeté, her body slicing through the air as though physics bent to her will. Gasps rippled through the crowd. What they saw was not a maid imitating dancers, but a legend reclaiming her throne. Marcus held his phone steady, recording every frame, capturing not only the dance but the faces of those who had mocked her. He caught William's pale complexion, Victoria's hollow eyes, Jonathan's stunned admiration. He knew that what he was filming was more than performance. It was evidence, testimony against cruelty, a truth that would shake more than just that room. The music built toward its climax, and with it Kesha unveiled her signature. She fused classical ballet into the waltz, a combination of movements she had once pioneered and perfected on the stage of the National Theater. A unique sequence that had been written about in glowing reviews and remembered by patrons of the arts. One woman in the audience, a supporter of every cultural event in Manhattan, gasped loudly. She recognized it. She whispered that she had seen this exact sequence before, years ago, though she struggled to place where. The recognition spread through the crowd like a wave, murmurs rising as realization dawned. Jonathan's camera shook slightly as his hands trembled, not from nerves but from awe. He knew, without fully understanding why, that he was witnessing genius. Unlike his father, he did not see race or status or uniform. He saw an artist, someone whose spirit transcended the limits imposed by arrogance. The music soared to its peak. Kesha spun into a series of fouettes, one after another, each turn executed with such precision that even seasoned professionals would struggle to maintain balance. She ended in a pose that blended strength and vulnerability, her arms wide, her head high, her breathing steady. For a long moment, the ballroom fell into silence. It was not the silence of boredom or cruelty, but the silence of awe. The silence that follows when human limits have been transcended before the eyes of those who never expected it. Then a single clap broke the stillness. Another followed, and another, until the entire hall erupted into applause so thunderous that the very windows rattled. Shouts of "Bravo!" filled the air, echoing off the marble. The elites of Manhattan, who had come to laugh at a maid, now rose to their feet, unable to deny what they had just seen. William stood frozen, pale as death, humiliated in front of every guest whose respect he craved. He had meant to mock her, but instead, he had been unmasked. Marcus stepped forward, still filming, and raised his voice for all to hear. He announced her true name, Kesha Maro, principal soloist of the American National Ballet, once lost to tragedy, but very much alive. The revelation detonated like a bomb. Gasps and exclamations filled the air. The impossible had become undeniable. Victoria staggered backward, her voice trembling that Kesha Maro was dead, that she had never danced again after the accident. But Kesha, steady and proud, corrected the rumor. The reports of her death had been exaggerated. The crowd laughed nervously, their amusement now directed at William, who had just humiliated himself in front of 200 witnesses. For William, reality struck with brutal force. He had publicly mocked not a maid, but one of the greatest dancers in American history, and worse, he had done so on video. The thunderous applause echoed like a storm that would not end. It rattled William's confidence more violently than any silence could have. He had mocked her in front of Manhattan's elite, and now every hand that clapped was a reminder that his cruelty had backfired. Kesha stood in the center of the ballroom, her chest rising with steady breath, her dignity unshaken. She had turned humiliation into triumph, and the entire city's power brokers had witnessed it. Marcus's voice rose above the roar, clear and commanding as he repeated her true name, reminding every guest that they were not applauding a maid, but a woman whose artistry had once defined American ballet. Her disappearance after the accident had become a tragic mystery, a footnote in cultural memory. And now here she was, resurrected in front of those who had tried to strip her of humanity. Shock rippled through the hall. Some whispered in disbelief. Some clutched pearls or glasses. Some struggled to reconcile the image of the maid with the legend they had once revered. Victoria, rattled, insisted that it was impossible, that Kesha Maro was gone forever, but the truth stood in flesh and spirit, before them, undeniable. Kesha had returned, not by choice, but by necessity, forced into revelation by cruelty, yet elevated by it nonetheless. William's voice cracked as he muttered that this was a trick, that it was impossible. His face had drained of color. His hand trembled around the champagne glass he still clutched. He tried to laugh it off, to regain some measure of control, but the sound came hollow, desperate, unconvincing. The crowd was no longer laughing with him, but at him. Jonathan, unable to remain still, stepped forward toward Kesha. He looked at her not as a maid, not as his father's pawn, but as a human being wronged. His words carried across the ballroom, apologizing for his father's cruelty, acknowledging that none of it should have happened. His honesty cut through the haze of arrogance and fear, but William snapped at him, screaming for silence, desperate to maintain the illusion of power that was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. Kesha remained calm, her voice level, her gaze steady, as she reminded William of his wager. He had mocked her publicly, dared her to dance, promised marriage to his son if she triumphed, and she had exceeded every expectation. She declared that a man of his wealth and stature surely would not break his own word in front of 200 witnesses. Her demand was not merely personal but symbolic: accountability, dignity, respect. William roared that it had been a drunken joke, not a contract. But Kesha was prepared. At her request, Marcus replayed the recording on his phone, the audio cutting through the ballroom like a blade. Every word William had spoken, every cruel condition, every escalation of humiliation played back clearly. His voice filled the room a second time, undeniable, permanent. The guests shifted uneasily, some laughing nervously, others whispering about the implications. William had written his own indictment with his arrogance, and now it was being held up for all to see. Panic flared in his eyes as he accused her of blackmail, but Kesha corrected him with unshakable calm. This was not blackmail. This was accountability. He had set the terms, she had met them, and the world was watching. Jonathan moved closer still, not as a son bound by duty, but as a man stepping into his own integrity. He offered his hand, declaring he would honor the wager not because he was forced to, but because dignity demanded it. He admitted that to marry a woman of such courage and talent would be an honor, not a burden. Gasps rippled again as the narrative shifted, the heir to the Thompson Empire siding with the very woman his father had mocked. William's rage broke loose. He shouted threats, swore that Jonathan would be cut off from wealth, from family, from everything if he dared stand against him. His desperation revealed the cracks in his empire. Jonathan, steady and resolute, responded with the words his father most feared. Some things are more important than money. Integrity cannot be bought. The audience, who had begun the evening complicit in William's cruelty, now saw the reversal with clarity. Their applause swelled not only for Kesha's artistry, but for the justice unfolding before them. They were witnessing not just the humiliation of arrogance, but the triumph of dignity. Kesha addressed William one final time. She reminded him that years ago men like him had declared her worthless after tragedy, that he had tried to reduce her value to race and labor, that he had believed cruelty was strength, but she had discovered a deeper truth. Nobility did not come from inheritance or wealth, but from how one treated others when no one was looking. She turned her gaze to Jonathan, acknowledging that despite his father's example, he had learned that lesson for himself. The room erupted again in applause, this time not merely for performance, but for truth spoken with grace. Even those who had laughed earlier now found themselves swept up in respect for the maid who had become a queen before their very eyes. William, defeated, muttered about lawyers and staggered out of the ballroom, his wife trailing behind him, both stripped of dignity in the eyes of their peers. Marcus ended his recording, aware that what he had captured would spread beyond these marble walls, that the world outside would soon know what had happened. Already whispers were spreading through the hall about social media, about headlines, about reputations collapsing overnight. William Thompson had built his empire on image, but now that image was poisoned beyond repair. Kesha, still standing, with the poise of an artist who had reclaimed her soul, did not bask in the humiliation of her enemy. She understood that true victory was not in destroying him, but in rising above him. She had reclaimed her dignity not through vengeance, but through excellence, through grace, through the quiet but unshakable truth of who she really was. The night, that began as a celebration of wealth, ended as a reckoning. By dawn, Marcus's recording had already made its way online. Within hours, the video spread across platforms, the headline impossible to resist. Millionaire mocks Maid, humiliated. By legendary ballerina. Millions of views poured in, each one another blow to William Thompson's empire. His arrogance, once his weapon, had become his undoing. Contracts evaporated overnight, board members demanded emergency meetings, and investors distanced themselves from the scandal. A man who had spent decades crafting an image of power now found his reputation shredded beyond repair. Jonathan returned home to find his father surrounded by newspapers, each headline sharper than the last. One declared the fall of a titan. Another demanded his resignation. For the first time, William looked not like a king, but a man cornered by his own cruelty. Jonathan stood firm, delivering the message that the board had already voted. He had 1 hour to resign or be forcibly removed. The betrayal William felt was not from his son, but from himself, though he would never admit it. He had built his fortune on intimidation, but fear could not protect him from truth. Meanwhile, Kesha awoke to a world transformed. Offers arrived from every corner of the globe. Ballet companies wanted her to choreograph special performances. Lincoln Center extended an invitation for a solo event in her honor. Film producers pitched stories about her life, sensing that audiences would flock to witness her journey from tragedy to triumph. Yet the offer that touched her most came not from the powerful, but from the small community school where she had once volunteered. The children she had quietly taught before taking the cleaning job had pooled their meager savings, $23 in crumpled bills and coins, to offer her a scholarship back into the world of teaching. It was not money she needed, but the sincerity behind it broke her heart in a way fame and fortune never could. She accepted, but on one condition: they would make it bigger. That seed of kindness grew into something remarkable. Donations poured in from around the world, fueled by the viral recording of her dance and the dignity with which she carried herself. In 6 months, the Kesha Maro Center for the Arts opened in Manhattan, a beacon of possibility where children from every background could discover their voices, their movements, their potential. The walls that had once excluded her now expanded, to include everyone, no matter their skin color, their income, or their struggle. Jonathan was there on opening day, no longer the reluctant son of a tyrant, but the leader of a reformed business empire built on social responsibility rather than greed. He was the center's first major donor, committing his resources to something that gave back to the city instead of taking from it. Together with Kesha, he symbolized what it meant to turn humiliation into transformation, cruelty into creation. William Thompson, stripped of power and influence, faded into obscurity. His wife filed for divorce and left the country, unwilling to share in the collapse of his legacy. Once courted by the elite, he was now avoided, a reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds a man to humanity. The last whispers placed him as a low-level consultant in a small firm, a shadow of the titan he once claimed to be. Marcus, who had quietly been the guardian of her story, stood beside Kesha during the center's first recital. Children of every background filled the stage with joy, their clumsy steps filled with more authenticity than all the polished vanity she had faced that night in the ballroom. He leaned toward her and admitted that the greatest victory was not in humiliating William, but in showing the world what true nobility looked like. It was not the cruelty of the powerful, but the resilience of the humble that shaped history. Kesha smiled, watching her new students wobble and twirl with innocent determination. She had lost everything once: her career, her body, her name. But in losing it, she had discovered who she really was. She had learned that greatness does not disappear when the world stops clapping. It waits quietly, biding its time, ready to return when it is needed most. Her revenge had never been about destroying William Thompson. It was about building something so beautiful, so enduring, that his cruelty would shrink into irrelevance. As the recital ended, Jonathan approached her carrying a bouquet of flowers he had grown himself in the garden he planted around the center. He asked if she was ready for dinner, his voice not demanding but hopeful. She accepted, not as a prize from a wager, but as a woman choosing her own path, her own story, her own future. Her life had circled back to its beginning, but this time with deeper purpose. She was not the same ballerina who had flown across grand stages. She was something more: an artist, a teacher, a survivor who had turned pain into grace and humiliation into triumph. And as the applause of children filled the hall, she knew the most powerful lesson of all. When prejudice is met with dignity, when cruelty is answered with excellence, the result is not merely victory, but transformation. Because in the end, true nobility is not measured in wealth or applause, but in how we rise when the world tries to break us. And what about you? Has anyone ever tried to silence your worth or dismiss your potential because of where you come from, how you look, or the work you do? Share your experience in the comments below, because your story matters and may inspire someone else who feels underestimated. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that remind us all that the greatest answer to prejudice is to rise higher, shine brighter, and prove through our actions that dignity and excellence can never be denied.